may have heard of the Mayan civilization in your history class, observed their ruins when you visited Mexico, or seen their portrayals in the Mel Gibson movie Apocalypto. You may also know them as the people who predicted our world's demise, a date that's constantly been shifted by conspiracy theorists every time the collapse of the Earth fails to materialize. But given our current multiple existential crises, it is likely one day those predicting the end of the world will be right. Broken clocks and all that. Anyway, over 1,000 years ago, the mighty Mayan civilization, one of the most impressive empires of the Western Hemisphere, just disappeared. How did the Mayans predict the end of the world, but fail to divine their own collapse? And how did their civilization fall apart anyway? We sent a very reluctant and panicked research team back in time to the moment just before the Mayan Empire fell, to find out what happened. The first signs of the Mayan civilization appeared in 1500 BC. In modern-day Guatemala, southern Mexico, and parts of Belize, small villages started to form, organized around the cultivation of maize or corn, beans, and squash. Gradually, the Mayans developed more advanced farming techniques, like irrigation and terracing systems. However, they weren't the only civilizations in the area at the time. In fact, the Mayans lived side by side with the Olmecs, widely regarded as the first mother culture of the region of present-day Mexico. Most archaeologists and historians believe the Olmecs significantly influenced Mayan society. However, more recent findings have raised questions about whether the Olmecs actually came first, or if the two civilizations developed simultaneously. Doctors Takeshi Inomata and Daniela Triadin, a husband and wife anthropologist team that we can only assume led an Indiana Jones-like existence, spent years excavating the ruins of the ancient Mayan city of Ceibal. Originally, Ceibal was thought to have been almost wholly influenced and inspired by the Olmec city of La Venta. However, when doctors Inomata and Triadin used radiocarbon dating on the oldest structures they discovered at Ceibal, they discovered that they predated most ancient construction found in La Venta by 200 years. Thus, it seems that the Olmecs were not the Mayans' mother civilization, but rather developed around the same time. Many archaeologists now believe that the definite distinctions between Olmecs and Mayans are erroneous to begin with, and it's likely that many such Mesoamerican mini-civilizations started developing concurrently after the start of maize agriculture, borrowing from and influencing each other, eventually likely blending into one big society. This belief is strengthened by the fact that mentions of the Olmecs gradually vanished from writings over time, and the Olmecs as a group seemed to disappear almost completely by 400 BC. However, the Mayan civilization continued to advance and grow at an impressive pace. Over the next centuries, the original Mayan villages kept growing and expanding until they became full-fledged cities. Unlike the first communities of basic houses and farms, these cities had large religious centers, temples, palaces, athletic fields, and public gathering places. The Mayans also engaged in extensive metalworking with gold and copper, and developed a complex hieroglyphic writing system that was only fully deciphered in the last century. Archaeologists estimate that the system of writing was created between 200 and 300 BC, which is earlier than initially thought. This shows that we're still learning about the Mayan civilization, and much of its history, culture, and daily life is still shrouded in mystery today. What we've gleaned comes from inscriptions, archaeological finds, and their only 4 surviving codices, as well as books written on paper made from wild fig trees held together by jaguar skin covers, because even Mayan books were badass. By the way, there are only 4 codices in existence because the Spanish destroyed most of the books when they found them upon arrival, decrying them as pagan. However, unlike most ancient Western Hemisphere civilizations, the Mayans were not brought down by the Spanish. The golden age of Mayan civilization was between 250 AD and 900 AD. If you were paying any attention during your high school history class, you might notice that 900 AD was long before the Spanish and English started colonizing the, quote, New World. Understanding what may have led to the collapse of the Mayan civilization means understanding the Mayans themselves. During the peak of their civilization, the Mayans made astounding advances in astronomy, architecture, and their calendar systems. In fact, the Mayans had one of the most complicated calendar systems in the world, based partly on their very accurate understanding of astronomy. They had 2 simultaneous calendars, one divided into 18 months of 20 days, and another, known as the long count calendar, divided into units called Baktun. The latter told us the world was supposed to end in 2012. Perhaps not shockingly, the calendar itself never actually said that. but a whole bunch of people for whom the apocalypse can't come soon enough interpreted it that way. What the long count calendar does say is that the full cycle of creation consisted of 13 Baktun, and the very last one of those would end on December 21st, 2012. However, this doesn't necessarily mean the collapse of the world as we know it. First of all, it's past 2012. The world's still here, though admittedly, it's not in the best state. Second of all, the Mayans had even longer units of measurement that counted millions of years and extended past the 2012 date. In addition to their surprisingly accurate contributions to calendar systems, they built glorious pyramids, some of which remain at sites like Chichen Itza, Tikal, Palenque, and Tulum, if you can even get to the latter through the throngs of Instagram influencers on the local beaches. Some of these pyramids were actually related to the Mayans' astronomical research. At the top of the pyramid at Chichen Itza, for example, there is a dome-shaped structure known as El Caracol that almost looks like a modern observatory. Though to our knowledge no telescope was housed there, the dome seems to have been perfectly aligned with the movements of Venus. It also provided a way for astronomers and religious figures of the day to get clear views of the sky, perched high above the canopy of the thick jungles of Central America. Part of the reasons the Mayans were so intent on accurately cataloging the movements of planets and stars is that they believed the movements of celestial bodies were intricately connected to the desires and the actions of the gods. As noted before when discussing the calendar system, the Mayans believed that life and time were a series of cycles. In fact, according to the Popol Vuh, a book that tells a lot of their mythology, the creation of man was also the result of a few cycles. Initially, humans were constructed out of mud and earth. As you could imagine from this structurally unsound combination, they quickly crumbled. The second cohort was built out of wood, but this too proved to be unsuitable, and they were washed away, presumably in one of the region's frequent tropical storms. So what ingredients finally did the trick and created the modern-day humans? Well, according to their mythology, the humans that finally became the Mayans were made out of maize, which should give you an idea of just how important that crop was to Mayan society. The Mayans valued many goods very differently from what we would expect in the modern day. For example, the gold of the area, something the Spanish would literally kill for centuries later, was only important for jewelry and religious items. Besides that, gold had no real monetary value in the Mayan world. They didn't even use coins. Instead, they preferred to trade and barter various goods with neighboring groups of people. Even when it came to precious metals and gemstones, jade was valued much more than gold. However, gold was used in religious rituals which sometimes involved, yeah, you guessed it, human sacrifice. In the Mayan world, there was a kind of heaven with 13 different layers and an underworld known as Xibalba, with 9 different layers, each ruled by a death lord that the souls of the dead had to pass through before ascending to heaven. That sounded, quite frankly, like a horrible journey. Maybe that's why the beliefs of the time allowed for a shortcut to getting not only into heaven, but supreme heaven, i.e. the top layer. This was reserved for those killed in sacrifice, either for religious reasons or at the ball court. We'll get to that later. And women who died in childbirth. Thus, the benefit of becoming a sacrifice seemed to be that you got to teleport straight to winning against the equivalent of the Afterworld's final video game boss. The drawback was that you would be painted blue, have a headdress put on you, have 4 men hold you down to represent the cardinal directions while your heart was removed, and then be decapitated, often after being extensively tortured. This would usually happen at the summit of a temple for maximum visibility, both to other Mayans and to the gods, for whom the sacrifice was the gift, a great blood offering. Other animals were sacrificed as well, but the blood of humans was considered the ultimate honor. Some of the events that merited human sacrifice included the dedication of a new temple or the rise of a new ruler. Others involved losing an apparently very high-stakes ballgame. Athletic fields have been discovered in Mayan cities in the shape of a capital I. At least one in Chichen Itza is bigger than the length of a modern football field. The game was not just for fun and sport. Like many things in Mayan culture, it was intricately connected to Mayan spiritual beliefs. It's supposedly based on a game that 2 of the most important Mayan spiritual figures, brothers by the name of Hunhunakpu and Xabalanque, played while they were still on Earth, and it signifies the battle between the forces of light and darkness. Only the right hip, right elbow, and right knee were allowed to make contact with the ball, and the ball itself, weighing approximately 6 to 9 pounds or 3 to 4 kilograms, could never touch the floor. The 2 teams would consist of 2 to 6 players each, and the goal was for the offensive team to get the ball back to the defensive team. preferably through a tiny, and we mean tiny, stone ring in the middle of the court, at the top of the border wall, while the defense's goal was to make the offensive team drop the ball. We're not sports specialists, but one team's job seems significantly easier than the other. You might be wondering where human sacrifice comes into all this. Well, quite a few historians believe that the losing team may have been ritually killed in those games, or in their place, a captured lord or king. Others believe this aspect of the ball game was exaggerated, and perhaps a captive or two may have been killed at the end of the game, but they were people who would have likely been sacrificed anyway. Either way, it is clear that the ball game held a very important religious significance for Mayan society, and courts for those games have been found throughout the former reaches of the Mayan civilization. This relatively unified mythology may give the impression that the Mayans functioned as one strong empire. However, the reality was that the civilization was split into units, akin to the Greek city-states, that would sometimes fight for control. Each city of the Mayan Empire had a local ruler known as an ahau, though some cities bucked the trend of autocracy. Seren, for example, was a village located in present-day El Salvador and buried around 600 AD in a volcanic eruption. Archaeologists working in the area found no evidence of an elite ruling class, and instead believe the village was set up communally. In other words, the hippies of the Mayan world. That being said, godlike rulers seemed to be the norm throughout the region, and some of them, like Bacal of Palenque, were buried inside their very own dedicated pyramids. Bacal was entombed with precious items like jade, funerary masks, and, of course, the bodies of 5 or 6 human sacrifices alongside it. Apparently, the phrase, "everyone dies alone," did not apply to Mayan rulers. One of the most well-known and powerful Mayan cities at the time, centuries before it became known as the home of Señor Frogs and American college students disappointing their parents, was Cancun. Various archaeological finds have confirmed that Cancun's status as a wealthy Mayan city extended up to 800 AD, though little remains from the society after that date. One of the last intricately carved panels depicting the ruler of Cancun has been dated to 795 AD. This is where we can start investigating how the Mayan civilization collapsed, as Cancun gives us one possible reason. Archaeologists have determined that around the year of Cancun's seeming collapse, the city was attacked. Evidence of mass violence has been found, including 38 separate bodies showing signs of violent, brutal trauma that died around that year. Whoever attacked Cancun massacred the royal family and buried them, along with their jewelry. Could the Mayan Empire have collapsed as a result of attacks? And who were the attackers? Well, some cities may have met their fate that way, but there's more to this story than meets the eye. You see, there are signs that the power of the Mayans was waning way before their empire mysteriously disappeared. The collapse itself didn't happen overnight, and the civilization likely fell over a period of 100 years, with various areas affected at different times. However, in some locations, it truly does seem like the local inhabitants just got up and left one day. For example, in the ancient city of Bonampak, one of the buildings has gorgeous murals adorning its walls. Though the murals start with the local ahau winning a glorious battle around the year 791, at some point the artwork just stops. There are half-finished sketches on one relatively blank part of the mural, still visible today, indicating that the artists were still working on it and planning to complete it, but instead they just left. Aguateca, located in Guatemala, has a similar eerie building within its borders. Builders and artists were constructing a temple, but at some point it became obvious they were either called away, left, or slaughtered in the middle of their work. Part of the temple stela had been smoothed, indicating they were about to be covered with the usual detailed carvings found in Mayan temples. But these carvings never materialized. Strangely enough, archaeologists also found evidence that in the years before the temple was mysteriously abandoned, the people of Aguateca had built additional defensive structures, like palisades and other fortifications. Could it be that they were threatened? Had an invader leveled neighboring cities and put them on edge? This phenomenon was observed throughout the area the Mayan civilization covered, not just in a few select cities. The collapse seemed to start around Patech Batun and then continued across the Usumacinta River. Scribes stopped recording history, artists stopped making sculptures, and buildings and artwork were left half-finished. The strange thing is that the Mayans themselves didn't disappear. Their descendants still live in Mexico and Central America to this day, speaking Mayan languages, most often in addition to the Spanish later imposed on them by colonizers. An estimated 7 million people identify as Mayans living throughout Guatemala, Belize, El Salvador, parts of Honduras, and of course the Yucatán Peninsula in Mexico, as well as other parts of the country. In fact, there are approximately 750,000 to 1.2 million Mayan speakers in the Yucatan alone. The number of people with Mayan surnames and ancestry is 3 times as high, though many may not speak Mayan anymore, especially as a first language. Mexico's National Institute of Geography and Informatics estimates that 60% of the Yucatan state's population speaks Mayan. Additionally, approximately 42% of Guatemala's population is of Mayan descent, and unfortunately, they tend to experience a fair amount of discrimination from the state. So, if the actual people are still here, what in the world happened to their civilization and cities? How did it all disappear? Clearly, they weren't completely ethnically cleansed or wiped out by disease, though the Spanish did later introduce the remaining Mayans to smallpox, which decimated a fair number of them, or any of the other horrible fates that can and have befallen indigenous populations. Well, here are some theories about the demise of the mighty Mayan Empire and why some cities seem to show evidence of brutal attacks. First, historians believe overpopulation may have contributed to the collapse of Mayan cities. The biggest Mayan city at the time, Tikal, reached a population of approximately 50,000 inhabitants at the beginning of the 9th century. This may seem like nothing compared to the billions upon billions of people currently crowding our planet. After all, to use a regional point of comparison, Guatemala City currently has a population of just under 1 million people. However, with resources and agricultural practices available to them, 50,000 people concentrated in one city would have put a huge strain on resources. The Mayans likely would have struggled to produce enough food to feed everyone in their population, leading to discontent, famine, and people seeking food to sustain themselves elsewhere, most likely in the countryside. Another theory about the disappearance of the Mayan civilization lends even more credence to this one. It explains why the fall of the Mayan cities happened relatively quickly in some areas. Researchers have found evidence of a massive and widespread drought in the lowlands around the Mayan cities at the beginning of the 9th century, which, if you recall, is the same time that the Mayan population reached its peak. Cambridge University researcher Nicholas Evans and his team analyzed sediment cores from Lake Chichen Itza in the Yucatán Peninsula, located within the lands of the Mayan civilization, that gave some great insights into the climate during the classical period of the Mayans. By examining oxygen and hydrogen isotopes in the sediments, Evans and his team found that the Mayans not only experienced a prolonged drought during the time of their collapse, but also intermittent prolonged droughts over a period of 400 years. Soil analysis shows that annual rainfall decreased by 41 to 54% for long periods during the 400-year time span. This is significant because it also shows why the Mayans may have struggled to build up food reserves to buffer themselves against prolonged periods of drought if they'd already faced several periods of low water supply. Unfortunately, the drought was likely partly caused by the Mayans' own practices, especially the final one that led to civilization's collapse. Mayan farmers practiced slash and burn agriculture, meaning that in order to grow the quantities of maize they needed to support an expanding population, they had to tear down a significant amount of surrounding forest. Trees were also used as fuel and construction materials. This deforestation likely caused a form of climate change in the immediate vicinity, with rising temperatures due to the lack of trees available to absorb atmospheric gases and much lower rainfall in the area. A drought like this would have exacerbated any existing food insecurity in the region and led to a lack of work for farmers, a lack of food for citizens, and generalized discontent. In turn, this could have easily contributed to not only Mayan subjects fleeing in search of food, but perhaps rebelling against their rulers for failing to secure better living conditions. This is where Mayan beliefs and culture also come into play. After all, the Ahaus and the ruling class were often connected to divinity and partly in charge of keeping the gods pleased in order to provide a good life for the people under their command. If the Mayans saw their food sources dwindling and nothing happening to stop it, they may have concluded that their local Ahaus were not doing their jobs or had displeased the gods in some way. This also raises the possibility that the hastily abandoned Mayan cities may not have all been attacked by outsiders. Some may have been deserted as the result of rebellions from their own populations, which would remove the need for commemorative artwork in temples for the area's rulers, as they would probably been among the first killed. However, the existence of additional defensive fortifications in some Mayan cities also points to some threat of outside interference. According to some historians, this could be evidence of attacks or the threat of attacks from other Mayan cities, not necessarily an entirely foreign force. The drought and food shortages could have caused increased infighting, with the state of warfare causing the availability of supplies to dwindle even further. Historians have discovered texts from the 9th century that mention conflicts between cities more frequently than usual. Archaeologists have unearthed panels depicting captured enemies and listing the names of the rulers defeated in battle. While various Mayan cities were at war with each other, the movement of troops and various skirmishes would have likely blocked trade routes, not to mention the ability of cities to trade with each other if they were at war. For the Mayan economy, which was heavily based on barter and trade, this would have been especially devastating, drastically decreasing the number of supplies that people could obtain to help their society function. In turn, this would likely spur some rulers to attack more neighboring cities in search of additional supplies for their own population. Thus, it's likely that a population peak, coupled with a drought and food shortages exacerbated by warfare, worked together to quickly destroy the mighty Mayan cities. However, these are not the only theories on the table. These theories are somewhat weakened by the idea that certain Mayan cities, Chichen Itza and Uxmal for example, continued to flourish for about 150 years after their sister cities had fallen. Then, these cities of the north of the Yucatán Peninsula mysteriously collapsed relatively quickly. So, what caused two collapses to occur about a century and a half apart? Well, into the 10th century, reliefs and inscriptions on the walls of the palace and other buildings of Uxmal show scenes of warfare and human sacrifice. Someone was around to carve them and fight in the wars, so it seems that Uxmal, though at war, was still present. In fact, the impressive governor's palace in Uxmal, which remains in the area today, was built in the 10th century. This leads historians to believe that Uxmal was not only surviving at the time, but thriving. In the 11th century, the same fate started to befall Uxmal and many surrounding cities of the former northern part of the Mayan Empire. New constructions and monuments were left half-finished, and the entire area around Uxmal, known as Puuk, was completely depopulated. This occurred around the same time as Chichen Itza continued to expand, but it too was eventually abandoned. No one really has a good idea as to why that happened. Perhaps the northern cities experienced less severe drought. Perhaps with the depopulated southern cities, they could source more supplies for their people and sustain themselves for a few decades. Perhaps, as some voices on the internet suggest, the Mayans were visited by aliens who ended their civilization and then they made a return trip. It seems likely that in the long term, the Mayans' agricultural and environmental practices were simply unsustainable and not conducive to supporting an ever-expanding population increasingly concentrated in urban centers. Though we still don't know exactly what happened to the Mayans, a combination of man-made drought, overpopulation, warfare, and political instability seem to be the most likely culprits for what brought the once mighty civilization to its knees. The good news is, we never have to worry about things like that leading to the doom of a society ever again. Today, many descendants of the Mayans preserve ancient rituals, customs, modes of dress, farming practices, traditional jewelry making, and even their ancestors' last names. So, in certain ways, Mayan culture continues onward, long after the civilization itself collapsed. Unfortunately, many indigenous descendants of the Mayans are heavily discriminated against in the countries in which they live, in ways that are often violent. During the 36-year-long Guatemalan Civil War, which ended in 1996, the victims of assault and murder were disproportionately Mayan. Now check out Aztecs versus Spartans. Who would win? Or watch this video instead.